and are filled with gladness, energy. And we're so happy that our special teachers who were here with us for our session agreed to stay on. And Soten Lynch will be giving us his Dharma talk. Soten has been training, Soten and Shanae, seen at the other end of that row. They've been training at the Great Vow Zen Monastery for 12 years, something like that. A while, quite a while. And recently completed a long trek through Central America. Soten has spent many years as a human being.
37.
37 years. And this month has experienced 2 sessions and a 100-mile race. So he's really primed. And welcome, and thank you so much for being here and sharing your Dharma with us.
Thanks. Shortly after Shanae and I were, well, actually, I'm not quite sure about the timing, but very early on in our residency, Levi/Jakuren was in residency at Great Vow, whom I haven't seen in, I think, 10 years. So nice to see you again. And greetings to all those in the cyber realm. Nice to see you all. There's someone there I haven't seen since our, I'm blanking on your name and I can't quite see it, but since our Sherry, yeah, since our precepts class. Hi there.
And Jiden.
And Jiden, whom I know.
Barbara from Seattle.
Montana.
Hongaku and Irene's iPad. Okay.
There she is. And Hongaku.
Oh yeah, I know her too. Welcome everybody. Earlier today, Shanae asked me what I wanted to talk about, and one of my teachers up at Great Vow has the monastery up in Klatskanai has encouraged me whenever I have the opportunity to give talks to make sure that I'm really doing so in such a way that references the Buddha's teaching and scripture within our lineage. So I told Shanae, well, maybe I'll talk about old age, sickness, and death. And Shanae said, but you haven't experienced any of those. Old age, sickness, and death are said to be the 3 signs in Buddhism, the 3 things that the historical Buddha observed which inspired their pursuit of the spiritual path. Sometimes 3 signs, sometimes 4 signs, the 3 being old age, sickness, and death, and the 4th being someone who was practicing the spiritual path. As the story goes, the Buddha hadn't observed these things until one day, at the age of 29, according to Wikipedia. They went out of the palace and observed old age, sickness, death, and active spiritual practice for the first time, and then was encouraged to pursue the spiritual path. So the significance for this as pertains to us is, what is it that inspires spiritual practice? How can we stoke that flame? And what is it that spiritual practice even means? Obviously, here in this tradition, we do the practice of seated meditation, which is a spiritual practice that has been taken on by many traditions for a very long time. But of course, spiritual practice is not limited to that. In the Fukanza Zengi Master Dogen, a big teacher in our lineage from 1200s Japan, says, how could spiritual practice be limited to sitting or lying down? How could it be just about, and I think what he was referencing there is the four postures of the Buddha. How could it but actually encompass, how could it not but encompass the entirety of our lives? And in the same fascicle, he said, yet given how even the ancient sages really wholeheartedly engaged very concrete spiritual disciplines, how could we today, with the distractions of our lives, dispense with them? How could we excuse ourselves from doing the practices that they would have done back then? And he was speaking from the 1200s, referring to just a few hundred years before himself. So what does practice mean? It's a word that really has become jargonized in spiritual culture. And when we talk to each other, we know what practice refers to, what my practice refers to, but let's look into that a little bit. It does seem that some kind of concrete contemplative practice is necessary along the spiritual path. And although seated meditation seems to have been primary amongst other contemplative practices throughout cultures and times, there are many. Dance, arts, poetry, fasting, ascetic practices, the practice of generosity, music, sexuality, relationship, have all been engaged in spiritual ways and in concrete ways. What is the quality that makes something a spiritual practice as opposed to a hobby? And in addressing that question, I wanted to first look at scripture. I, over the last 10 years, have heard the term a lot, the three marks of Buddhism, and the three marks being impermanence. Everything changes, is in a state of flow. No fixed self, no inherent separation existing between the individual and the flow of that experience. And number three, dukkha, that dissatisfaction is part of the experience of living. I don't know if in the original Pali Canon, the Buddhist scriptures, there's any reference to the three marks of Buddhism, or if these are specifically attributed to existence, the three marks of existence. And now we kind of use them as the three marks of Buddhist teaching. Because I looked it up and I could only find them in Theravadan teachings as the three marks of existence. But as the Buddha said, these are the three marks of existence. Let's allow them to be the three aspects that characterize Buddhism. Therefore, three aspects that could make something spiritual practice. The one, impermanence. In our practice, in our discipline, are we feeding something that is limited, that cannot continue to grow? Or are we feeding something boundless? Are we feeding the finite or the infinite? Mushin mentioned I have a running practice, which is true. And I remember when I was in high school, my mom got me a copy of Runner's Magazine, something like that. She was wondering if this was going to be a hobby I would get into. And I remember reading an article at that age that talked about how sooner or later someone can't continue running just because they enjoy improving or getting faster. And at that age, that literally made no sense to me whatsoever. I could not find any reason in that statement why someone would want to do something if they weren't at a rapid rate watching obvious personal progress, and more than that, relative progress against their peers. It made no sense to me. And now it's so interesting how the view is completely the opposite. Like, how could that sense of progress really be the sole source of inspiration for something? And that's clearly something that in a way is out of our control. That's not where satisfaction is found. So is the recognition of impermanence part of our practice? 2, no self, anatta. Are we really using our practice to examine the interconnectedness of things, or are we trying to stand apart? The first 100-mile race that I did, I had a big inner critic attack afterwards about how I had done. I was very embarrassed and had a lot of negative self-thought for about a day afterwards, and was practicing with that in meditation, and had a pretty deep experience that brought me out of that. And I saw very clearly that in a very tangible way, just by participating in the event, I had helped the person who won win. Everybody in the event, not to mention running culture, but everybody in the event was in relationship with somebody else. And the whole time I was in relationship with the person ahead of me and the person behind me. And the person ahead of me was in relationship with me and then the person ahead of them, etc., all the way to the back and all the way to the front. And then I really felt connected with the fact that the person who won, and that the person who just crossed the finish line before they turned the lights off and drove home managed to cross the finish line. And everything shifted in my view, and it wasn't personal anymore. And it provided for me a more satisfying reason to participate in events like that, seeing how, yes, how I do matters, but it matters in the context of larger things. Are we really trying to contribute to something larger, or just trying to secure some kind of personal safety, some kind of personal success in pursuing an art, an instrument, a trade? Are we trying to push the boundaries of that field? Or are we just trying to become individually accomplished and recognized? Number 3, the third mark of existence, or the third aspect of practice, dukkha, the presence of suffering. Another younger adult story. I had a music lesson with a guitar teacher whose name was Terry Bremkamp. That's his name. And I had a injured thumb. I think I jammed my thumb. And one day he aggressively grabbed my hand and moved it, and it hurt, and I kind of yelped. And he said to me very roughly, there's nothing in life worth getting that doesn't hurt. Another thing that I could not understand at all, it made sense to me, not in the least, how pain could be inherently woven with the path of a meaningful pursuit. It made no sense to me then. So recognizing this third aspect of practice, are we really committed to experiencing the full spectrum of things with respect to our practice, or are we just in it for the good stuff? Maybe this is what distinguishes a passion from a hobby. Maybe this is what distinguishes a spiritual practice from something that we do to pass time or for entertainment. If we were to take on drinking coffee as a spiritual practice, perhaps then there would not be any bad coffee, just coffee with subtle notes of burning rubber with a flatness that diminishes sensitivity. Because when we really take something on as practice, we take on all of the details therein. Sometimes this third aspect, this third mark, dukkha or dissatisfaction, is turned and taught as liberation instead. In our practice and our discipline, are we really hoping to wake up to what's right in front of us, or are we waiting till it passes in hopes that the next thing will? So we have impermanence or flow, no self or interconnection or interbeing, the wonderful word from the Thich Nhat Hanh community. Or suffering and liberation, dukkha and liberation. One more comment on that third mark. Are we really looking for a kind of lasting freedom? As a metaphor, if dukkha, if suffering were a rock in our shoe, we could avoid the rock in our shoe just by walking funny, which might create other issues in our gait. But the direct path of liberation would be taking the rock out. And of course, we've got lots of rocks, so it takes lots of rock removal. So there's some on what is practice. Now, what inspires practice? In the story that's at the root of this tradition, there's this person who was awakened to something by observing old age, sickness, and death. And inspiration was awakened within this person. The Tibetan tradition, there's the teaching of the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. towards the aspiration to practice, towards the aspiration to awaken. Preciousness of the human life is one. So these are four things to reflect upon, which may arouse the aspiration to practice. Preciousness of human life, the reality of death, karma, cause and effect, that we have agency, and that agency has effects, and the suffering of samsara, the cyclical patterns of suffering that we find ourselves in. The first, preciousness of a human life, may also be described as the preciousness of encountering the Dharma. I think this is a bigger than human thing. The preciousness of encountering the Dharma, how rare it is, or how wonderful an opportunity it is when those moments present themselves to us in which some long existent habit of suffering that we have has somehow been removed in such a way that we see we don't really have to go there anymore. But if we're really not going to go there anymore, we'll have to continue with diligence. The preciousness of encountering the Dharma, of having a group of people that would support us to continue in practicing in such a way, and encountering a body of teachings that may help us recognize what those thorns look like within us, that we may look out for and learn how to remove. Second thought that turns the mind towards awakening, the reality of death, and not just our own, but the reality that our species, like every species that has come before us, at some point, we don't know when, will be on the extinction list of old. And what context does that put all of our considerations in? To know that at some point we'll all just be something of the past. Third thought, karma, cause and effect, recognizing that we all have some degree of agency. As beings, we are capable of changing things in an absolute way. We literally can do this and make the universe different in so doing. And that's more true than any attempt to quantify, well, how different is the universe by my doing that? Because we could just kind of spin off forever by naming how big or small of an effect we make, but we really can recognize that we absolutely do have an effect. And the fourth thought, the suffering of samsara, that we are all perfectly capable of suffering basically forever if we don't really step in, or maybe someone else steps in to help us and create some pause in our mode of operation. Maybe a fifth thought that would turn the mind towards the incentive to practice could be recognition of the interconnection of all life. That our happiness and our suffering really belongs to everyone and affects everyone, and that theirs does ours. And this can be as simple as our moods affect each other. So, what did the Buddha realize on those days, encountering old age, sickness, and death? And how is it relevant to us? One personal story about death that I like to share is one time when I was running up in Klatskanai on a summer day, I encountered a vulture on the side of the road with its wing over its head. And I was curious, so I went over and I moved its wing, and it was still alive, and its eye was wide open looking at me. And I stood with it for a while, and it was curious, it could still move its eye around a little bit. And eventually I put the wing back over its head, and I continued on with my run, came back the next day. It was still there, a little less alive, but could still open its eye. It was about 4 or 5 days before it died. There was a skunk roadkill up the road, so I assume it was eating a skunk, and a car came around the turn, broke the vulture's wing, and it was over on the side of the road, right adjacent the asphalt when we were having an intense heat wave. So there were 90-degree, 100-degree days, and it was just sitting there baking on the asphalt for a good part of a week, living, being alive. Which is really beautiful. That sitting and slowly dying of dehydration, baking in the hot sun on pavement alone for days, is life. That's what life is. And it's really no better than my own life. It's really no worse than my own life. It's equally how life can be. And I may well end up in that situation myself. Just given the ways that things can unfold, what's really important. Sometimes we don't realize the expectations that we carry until reality points them out. We realize we assumed that we were going to be able to do something until all of a sudden we can't. We realize we thought someone was going to be a part of our life until all of a sudden they're not. We realized we thought we were being really helpful by doing this thing until we found out all these people were really annoyed at our doing that. When Shanae and I were traveling, we spent a couple months in a very small town high in the mountains in Guatemala, above Antigua in the capital. And there was a family that had a funeral for a loved one that had died while we were there. And the funeral was a week-long event that would have a vigil every night. And every day, the house would be open with chairs inside, photographs, candles would be inside, and people would just come and go from the room all week long, recognizing this person and supporting this family. After we left that town, a home had caught on fire, and 12 people had died in that home. This is a tiny town with 1,000 or 2,000 people. And something like 1,000 people from outside of the town came to this funeral of this family. Not people who knew the family, but people who came in order to support this village grieving this loss. I believe I'm sharing this because I was so inspired by a culture's relationship with death. So I think in spiritual practice, we seek to have our hidden expectations revealed to us. So how do we do that? We just finished a sesshin here. Sesshin is a great way to discover not only what we think about things, but whether or not what we think is even true. Right down to who we think we are, how we think we should be, how we think the world is, or how we think the world should be, down to whether or not there even is such a thing called a world out there that is this way or that way. And how does this work? How does this vehicle of sesshin help us discover these truths about ourselves? I'll answer that in a little bit, because it's not the only vehicle to do that. And sesshin is not for, valuable as it is, it's not for everybody. Long distance running is one of my hobbies, and one of its perpetual lessons for me is that the burden of the future is not upon my shoulders. For example, one of the lessons in running 100 miles is that if somebody asks me, how do you do that? Often my answer from personal experience is, you don't. Running 100 miles, running 1 mile is not something that you ever do. And this is obvious, right? Because all you ever do is take a step. And the reality is you never do more than that at any point in time. During the race that Mushin just described, a couple weeks ago, I had gone to rest a little at mile 80 and got up at mile 80 trying to do 20 more. And the concept of it was completely unbearable. But the doing of it was actually quite tolerable. And once I had in my mind that all I was going to do is what I could, and any number really just didn't matter at all. The body just kind of kept going, and it got kind of fun at the end. Both long distance running and sesshin are two things that involve a steady practice over time. One of my teachers said on a previous sesshin flyer, Zazen takes time, Zazen meditation takes time, deep Zazen, which leads to insight, takes more time. Oh, that was it. Zazen takes time. Deep Zazen, which leads to insight, takes more time. Insight. Deep Zazen, which leads to insight or realization of truths that are liberating. Taking rocks out of our shoes. And then years later, when I was encouraging us to have more Zazen on our residential schedule, he said to me, you know, Zazen really is not about time, it's about intention. So how do we have the right intention? How do we bring the right intention into things? Sooner or later, it comes down to prayer and surrender. The Tibetan meditation retreats I've participated in have all involved some ritual before the meditations in which we pray to higher powers that the seeds of awakening may be planted within us, that the intention to awaken may be aroused within us. The AA community focuses on the importance of a higher power and the importance of spiritual practice and the 11th step. There's several beautiful quotes in that tradition pertinent to the 11th step. I wrote down a few here. To pray for knowledge of God's will or the higher power's will for us and the power to carry that out. Another prayer, please grant that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, and to love than to be loved. Another prayer, please direct my thinking that it may be empty of self-pity, dishonesty, and fear. These are all so rich with the quality of humility. And humility is maybe the one reliable thing brought on by old age, sickness, and death. My older brother works with professional athletes working at Nike. And I asked him once if the training that athletes do, which is extremely intense, brings a certain maturation about them as people. And his response when I asked that question was, not really until they experience their first injury in their career, or the young people start moving up from the ranks and challenging their value in the profession. Don't wish to make a blanket statement like that about a population, but it was an interesting observation that he shared. We say that old age, sickness, and death are inevitable, but really the only one of them is that the only one that is inevitable is death. And we're lucky if we get to experience the other two. I said that I would return to how does Sesshin help us see these aspects about ourselves. Well, I think most people enter it with these prayers that I just shared somewhere in the heart. And if we really open up to these kinds of prayers, really seeking humility and seeking a humble place in the body of things, and really let that prayer guide us. Wherever it takes us may be quite revelatory. Sesshin itself is really a practice of surrendering what we think and what we know. And that's what meditation practice is, which Sesshin supports for continuous hours and days. And if we really give our hearts to that, eventually all that remains is what's more deeply true within us. So I pray that we may all see our lives in the great context of things, and that may bring humility, and that we may see our lives not as opportunities for success or failure, but as opportunities to connect with something larger beyond the individual, in relationship with more and more, and that may lighten ourselves from the burdens that we've carried for who knows how long. And if we are, insofar as we feel liberated from the release of these burdens, may we recognize that liberation, that enlightening that we experience lessens the burden for all that we come in contact with. One final anecdote. I was out in the John Day fossil beds a month ago, where there are some of the clearest skies in the United States, and someone had a telescope and pointed the telescope at Jupiter. And we were all looking at Jupiter's moons through the telescope. It made me really happy. Thank you all.
Please turn to page 5.